Welcome. On behalf of the Transcendentalism Council and the Racial Justice Action Group of First Parish in Concord, welcome to all of you who are here materially and digitally. The Transcendentalism Council has been organizing and presenting programs like this one for over 16 years, programs that educate and celebrate the women and men who made Concord the home of American independence and imagination. And we're very, very happy to welcome once again Jim Sherblom to this pulpit. Our Concord neighbor, Jim Sherblom, he is, among other things, a transcendentalist, an author, a theologian, an entrepreneur. He earned a bachelor's from Yale, MBA from Harvard, and Master of Divinity and Doctor of Ministry from Yale Divinity School. He served for 10 years as a parish minister and was Senior Vice President and CFO of Genzyme Corporation. Tonight, he will speak about his fourth book, Stories of Concord, Volume 2. He has previously published 3 other books, Stories of Concord, Volume 1, Spiritual Pilgrim, Awakening Journeys of a 21st Century Transcendentalist, Spiritual Audacity, 6 Disciplines of Human Flourishing, and he also hosts a local podcast, local history podcast called Concord Stories. And all of his books will be available for sale and signing downstairs in the parish hall after the lecture. Just a couple of housekeeping things. We will have a reception downstairs in the parish hall. To get to the parish hall, go out through that door and down the stairs. If you would like to use an elevator, also go through that door, but before you get to the stairs, turn right, and that will take you to the elevator. This is the first in a series of 4 lectures that Jim will be giving. The next one will be this Friday, June 5th. That's going to be right next door at the Wright Tavern. The one following that, this following Friday, is June 12th. That's going to be at Newbury Court. On July 2nd at 3 p.m., he will be speaking at the Harvey Wheeler Community Center over in my neighborhood in West Concord. There will be a Q&A at the end of the lecture. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for me to bring the microphone to you before you ask the question. That way our friends on Zoom will hear the question too. So thank you very much. Welcome to First Parish and welcome to Jim Sherblom.
Thank you, Victor. So I want to welcome you to Concord's uncensored, unredacted religious history. This isn't the way we used to tell it. But based upon archaeological remains, what became the Nipmuc people were part of the Paleo-Indian migration from Asia, crossing the Bering Land Bridge 14,000 years ago. 10 or 11,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, they followed the large game north to the Musketaquid River Valley. So they have a bigger claim here than any of the rest of us. These Stone Age settlers developed a rich religious culture that placed them alongside eagle, owl, crow, deer, fox, turkey, and muskrat in the cycle of life. Manitou, the Great Spirit, was the fundamental life force from whom Nipmunks believed all life derived. A good life meant balancing personal, family, and tribal needs within the circle of life. Over thousands of years, they created a stable, thriving landscape of small farming, hunting, and fishing communities. I think we need to start with that because this was a much longer period than the period since the settlers came. Each clan was led by an Sagamore leader and a shaman teacher. A shaman's power derived from the ability to save the clan from death and diseases through his offerings to Manitou. The Great Plague, which accompanied the white men's arrival, left white people who worshiped the white man's God relatively immune, but inexplicably deaths undermined the clan's trust in Manitou. This was the beginning of the destruction of a culture that had been here for thousands of years. In 1533, Henry VIII separated the Church of England from Roman Catholicism, throwing England into a religious civil war. Over the next 20 years, Henry suppressed the Catholic monasteries and distributed their lands to his nobles. He was succeeded in 1553 by Queen Mary, a devout Roman Catholic, known as Bloody Mary, for the bloodbath she encouraged among Protestant clergy. The idea that God sanctioned banishing or killing people flourished. This is what they brought with them. Many Puritans, Baptists, and Separatists fled to Holland. When she was succeeded 5 years later by Queen Elizabeth, an Anglo-Protestant, many of them returned to England only to find that the new Anglican Church despised them as much as the Catholics did. Wealth and power followed the favored religion, and it kept changing. When King James ascended the throne in 1603, he declared, "I will have none of that liberty as to religious ceremonies. I will have one doctrine, one discipline, one religion, in substance and in ceremony, and as to the Puritans, I will make them conform, or I will drive them out of the land, or hang them." When we talk about the Puritan ancestry, we sometimes ignore the part of what they were escaping. In 1605, King James created two commercial ventures, Plymouth Plantation and the Virginia Company, to settle and extract wealth from the crown, from the as yet unconquered parts of the New World. The first 10 to 15 years of these new ventures were a commercial failure. No one wanted to risk their lives among the heathens in the wilderness merely to enrich the English crown. Then his counselors suggested a way to solve two problems at once: allow the oppressed Puritans, Separatists, and Baptists their religious freedom if they would populate the wilderness for the king. In 1620, the Pilgrim Separatists were the first to arrive, followed a decade later by increasing numbers of Puritans and eventually Baptists as well. The Puritans were a radical sect within the Calvinist movement. They tried to live more purely to earn their place in heaven. Facing persecution in England, the Puritans fled to the new land, bringing their Geneva Bibles and Calvinist beliefs. They believed God chose them to build a new Jerusalem, a shining city on a hill, to be a beacon to nations, just as God had destined the Hebrews to conquer Canaan as their promised land. They drew adventurous and pious people. Of course, many of them had no idea how to survive in this new land. The most prominent piece is they destroyed the fields that had been highly productive for hundreds of years because they didn't follow the indigenous practices of putting fish into the hill when they were growing their vegetables, which was a way to replenish the soil year after year rather than drawing it out all of its nutrients. Reverend Peter Buckley was English nobility, a 10th generation descendant of Baron Robert Buckley, who helped force the Magna Carta on King James in the 13th century. Born in Ordell, England in 1583, the son of a Puritan minister, he graduated from St. John's College, Cambridge, which was a notorious training center for Puritan ministers. He married Jane Allen of English nobility, who died giving birth to their 12th child in 14 years. Yes, that's their 12th child in 14 years, half of whom died before the age of 10. He married again Grace Chetwood, another noblewoman, and when Archbishop Laud banned Peter from preaching in England, he and Grace escaped arrest by traveling to Boston in 1635 with 4 of their sons. Peter was already known in the Mass Bay Puritan circles because Robert John Cotton, who was a leader in those circles, was a classmate from Cambridge, so they were warmly welcomed. Simon Willett, a Kentish soldier and fur trader with the indigenous tribes, had arrived the year before and sought out Buckley as a respected, wealthy partner to petition the Mass Bay legislature to allow them to a grant of land 20 miles west of Boston, in Nipmuc lands to establish the town of Concord. Reverend Peter Buckley became an indispensable leader, scholar, and aristocrat for this little Puritan colony. In Sunday worship, he used the Calvinist Geneva Bible, the same text he'd used in Odell. He complained that the New King James Version of the Bible was far too Anglo-Catholic for him. You might mention this when you talk to Bible Baptists in the South. We've never allowed the King James Version Bible to be used in this pulpit. Reverend Buckley was the preacher and teacher while his co-minister, Reverend Jones, was pastor. Despite being his firstborn, Edward Buckley seemingly had a troubled relationship with his father, Reverend Peter Buckley. After his mother, Jane, died, Edward kept his distance from his father and stepmother, Grace. Shortly after their wedding, he dropped out of college and moved to the Mass Bay colony. So he arrived here a year before his parents. After his father co-founded First Parish in Concord, Edward returned to Odell to marry Lucy Lenton, a destitute widow 2 years younger than he was, and mother to a young girl named Lucy. This must have been a scandal because neither the First Parish archives nor the official Buckley family genealogy make any mention of their marriage in Odell or her daughter Lucy. Edward and Lucian had children together, Elizabeth in 1638 and Peter, named after his famous grandfather, in 1641. Peter and Grace agreed to raise these two children as their own in Concord if Edward and Lucian would accept ordination among the separatists of Plymouth. Let's get the hell out of Mass Bay. Edward served as the minister in Marshfield for 17 years until his father's death in 1659. In 1666, the Harvard-trained Nipmuc James Printer published, I'm going to gobble this name, Mamusa Wuntanima Panarumuva, Biblium God, the Algonquin Bible. Reverend Elliott and Thomas Wabern had been collaborating on it for almost 30 years. This Bible translation became the center of indigenous Christian worship. The Algonquin terminology, metaphors, and worldview reflected a far more universalist depiction of God and his divine mercy than one might have assumed sitting in a Calvinist Sabbath service. It was a very positive view of Christianity. Puritan beliefs helped shape indigenous Christianity as indigenous Christians also influenced Puritan theology, helping it become more tolerant of universalist beliefs and increasingly welcoming Anglicans, Baptists, and even non-disbelievers. Over time, American Protestantism became increasingly different from that practice, whether Puritan or Anglican practiced in England. We had our own Yankee Protestants. They had a different view of the world. When French and Irish Catholics came, religious beliefs changed again. They remained pious, but each community had its own covenant, its own way of relating to God. The historian Alfred Hudson describes Concord Sabbaths of this period as follows. It was the practice of the people in colonial times to close the work of the week about sundown Saturday night. The gate was shut down at the mill, the door was closed at the store, the children put away their playthings, and all this in preparation for holy time. Within the domicile was the like strict observation of Sabbath sanctuary. We know this because anyone who's seen violating Sabbath sanctity was brought before the town magistrate and to be reprimanded and fined. And the fines could be as much as 10 days' labor. A typical 17th century First Parish worship service opened with an invocation to godliness, singing psalms, reading from the Old Testament, exhortatory prayers, a reading from the New Testament, an hour-long sermon that attempted to be exegetical, expository, doctrinal, and finally closing with practical applications for your daily life. This was followed by singing more psalms. Congregational singing was generally a cappella and, quite frankly, very awful. The songbook provided 100 suitable tunes, which could be mixed and matched with 150 psalms as desired. A deacon would announce which tune the psalm would be sung to, but sometimes different congregants would substitute other tunes they preferred. So each went their own way. The service ended with a benediction. After a break for lunch, we would do it again. They would do it again, in the afternoon. I grew up in a small town in Rhode Island where we were still using the old 100 as our most common musical theme to match with different songs. Puritan funerals were secular affairs centered around contemplating your own mortality while looking at the dead body and consuming great quantities of alcohol to ease the pain. The minister might be present as another mourner, but no official position. Hudson describes the funeral at the meeting house. No scripture was read, no psalm sung, no prayers said, and after a few words of consolation, the mourners lined up to view the non-embalmed body, which was now rotting in its casket. Even little children were lifted up to see and smell the stink of death themselves. When all had said their goodbyes, the coffin was closed, covered with a cloth, and lifting it onto their shoulders, the ushers carried it on their shoulders all the way to the burial ground, with everyone walking behind them. The burial was performed in silence, each in turn stepping forward to toss a handful of dirt on the coffin, the cold earth rattling harshly as it hit the coffin. When each had said farewell, the sexton buried the coffin while everyone contemplated his or her mortality. The Puritans were big on contemplating their mortality. Reverend Joseph Estabrook was recruited to Concord in 1667 as a colleague for the frail and aging Reverend Edward Bulkley. He built his home on the north side of the Concord River, raised a family, and preached sermons well regarded for their scholarship and eloquence, no doubt the result of his Harvard education. He became Concord's sole minister when Edward Bulkley died in 1696. A subsequent First Parish minister, Reverend Grindal Reynolds, described Estabrook as eminent in his skill in the Hebrew tongue, indefatigable, laborious in his ministry, in his preaching plain, practical, and persuasive, in his intercourse with the people grave, affectionate, and conciliatory. During his ministry, he replaced the military drum used to call people to worship with a church gong that hung from a big tree in front of the meeting house. To know how he was regarded by his congregation, his nickname in his later years as pastor was the Apostle. The original Puritan settlers of Concord refrained from hard alcohol. However, that changed over time. As early as 1660, the Concord selectmen granted William Buss the right to sell alcohol and keep a house of commons entertainment. Dancing, however, was prohibited, even at wedding receptions, for fear it might lead to fornication. And in 1664, Concord enacted a penalty for rude singing of songs while intoxicated, for fear it might lead to lewd behavior. By the early 18th century, alcohol consumption was commonly accepted, especially among men, but drunkenness was considered a sin. Concord historian Ruth Wheeler writes, "There can be little doubt that drinking increased during this period. Beer and hard cider were everyday drinks in the 17th century. Now the importation of molasses made rum readily available, and it was widely used. Every trade or transaction was followed by a drink to seal the deal. Every public gathering from a minister's ordination to a house raising meant a drink, and soon the records show substantial amounts spent, even at a pauper's funeral, for rum to ease the pain." Reverend John Whiting was called to Concord in 1711 to fill the vacancy caused by Reverend Estabrook's death. He was Concord's first minister to display alcohol abuse. Whiting was a 31-year-old Harvard graduate, a descendant of Reverend Peter Bulkley, a member of the Harvard Corporation, and married to Mary Cotton, granddaughter of Reverend John Cotton, Bulkley's lifelong friend. As an educated, attractive married man with a private fortune, John and his wife Mary were welcomed into Concord's elite. Befitting a rural village, Concord ministers had traditionally been paid in farmland, agricultural goods, and chopped wood. Now, as a rising commercial center, Whiting received 100 pounds sterling annually, roughly equal to about $5,000 a year today. Minister was very much a part-time job, as was lawyer or doctor, that most everybody made their subsistence from farming. Whiting brought new hymns, new theology, and other innovations to his ministry as well. He read the Bible in Greek and Latin and translated the relevant passages from the pulpit, something that hadn't been done at First Parish since Reverend Peter Bulkley's death. In 1714, he acquired Concord's first organ, which carried a bit of controversy. The organ had originally been gifted to the Brattle Street Church in Boston, but the Congregational Church rejected it as being too Anglican. Even the King's Chapel in Boston, which was Anglican, rejected it as too innovative. So Whiting claimed it for Concord in hopes of improving congregational singing. Not everybody welcomed these changes, but many did. This was for them the future coming along. Over the next 20 years, he enjoyed a successful ministry, and he and Mary had 6 children. They were Concord's leading couple. Then Mary died in 1731 at the age of 42, leaving Whiting having lost the love of his life, but even more so with 6 children acting out their grief and sorrow. Whiting sank into heavy drinking, rising drunk to argue at town meetings and seemingly inebriated in the pulpit some Sabbaths. Friends suggested he marry the town's most elite widow, Rebecca Buckley Prescott, for the sake of his children, but this did not stop his drinking. For years he kept promising to reform, but each time he relapsed. The selectmen tried to be sympathetic, but this was a disgrace. The selectmen called a council of 7 ministers from surrounding congregations. One cold October evening, these ministers met with the Concord congregation to give their advice. The council was led by Reverend Colonel John Hancock Sr. of First Parish in Lexington, grandfather of Patriot and Constitution signer John Hancock, himself reportedly a very heavy drinker. The council was unanimous. We advise and direct the Church of Christ in Concord to remove the Reverend John Whiting from his pastoral office because of lapses of a more aggravated nature after public promise to reform. A large part of the congregation was scandalized, but Concord's elite mostly stuck with Reverend Whiting and his family. The Whitings remained popular with Concord's elite, and Rebecca's fabulous social events continued on. However, many in the congregation wanted to find and recruit a more pious minister. Born in Springfield, Massachusetts in 1715, Daniel Bliss had a born-again experience while a student at Yale under the preaching of Jonathan Edwards. The American Great Awakening was a Pentecostal faith where emotional engagement with religion counted for far more than reasoned theology. Born-again individuals brought a more fervent and boisterous approach to their worship and prayer services by surrendering themselves to the Holy Spirit. Reverend Bliss was only 24 years old when he was invited to assume the First Parish pulpit. In his description of First Parish ministers, Reverend Reynolds wrote, "As a preacher, Reverend Bliss had striking qualities. He replaced the somewhat formal utterance of the pulpit of that day with the fiery earnestness of the revivalist. Accepting to the utmost the stern dogmas of Calvin, his soul was on fire. Sometimes he was moved to tears. Often he rose to denunciation. His voice grew louder and louder, his gestures more and more extravagant, his calls to repentance more fearful and commanding." Not everybody wanted that kind of minister. Reverend Whiting and Reverend Bliss could not have been more different in temperament, theology, or preaching style. Reverend Bliss abstained from all hard spirits, while Whiting continued to struggle with his alcoholism. Reverend Bliss organized revival meetings, sometimes multiple times a month, where hysterical people committed themselves to Christ. It is said Whiting and Bliss loathed each other. Bliss publicly denounced heretical Harvard and the surrounding Harvard-trained congregational ministers for their increasingly humanist ways. Historian Ruth Wheeler quotes one of Reverend Bliss's 1755 sermons, which I offer you as a sense of what was going on. He said, "The torments of the damned will never cease. Under this weight of God's wrath, neither will his eye spare not his heart pity until they shall have suffered as many ages as there have been moments from the beginning to the end of time." Sinners in the hands of an angry God. These were the beginnings of Concord's religious diversity. By the time of the American Revolution, Concord had many diverse senses of faith, but most congregations lacked funding since the taxes all went to pay for First Parish. Sunday, January 1st, 1766 was a bleak New England day. In the unheated meeting house, First Parish called Reverend William Emerson, a great-great-grandson of the Reverend Peter Buckley, as their new minister. At the age of 23, this young, highly enthusiastic, emotional idealist boarded initially with his predecessor's widow, Reverend Bliss's widow, Phoebe. Young William soon fell in love with Phoebe's eldest daughter, also named Phoebe, and they were married 6 months later. William acquired land along the Concord River on the site of an ancient indigenous people's village and built the house now known as the Old Manse. Over the next decade, William and Phoebe had 5 children. Reverend Emerson was the first to preach American liberty and sedition from the pulpit. He also advanced reason and religion over piety. For example, in a sermon on the hereafter, he focused more on joys of heaven than fears of hell, upheld reason and doctrine over quoting biblical passages, and cited Plato and Muslims as additional proofs of God's promise of immortality for the human soul. In 1775, General George Washington Army was occupying the Harvard campus in Cambridge as part of the siege of Boston. So Reverend Emerson offered for Harvard to meet in Concord for the 75-76 academic year. They sat classes in this meeting house, studied at Reverend Emerson's home library, and boarded at various houses around town. Ezra Ripley was a Harvard senior who spent a lot of time studying with the minister and his young family. As the fighting moved west, Reverend Emerson joined the Continental Army at Fort Ticonderoga. Unfortunately, he died of camp fever and didn't make it home. So First Parish needed another minister. Ezra was newly graduated from Harvard and seemed the ideal candidate. He boarded with Emerson's widow Phoebe, and eventually fell in love with her, even though she was 10 years his senior. They married 2 years into his ministry, so Phoebe Bliss Emerson Ripley, the daughter of one First Parish minister and wife of 2 more, must have been a very lovable person and seemingly devout. Reverend Ripley inherited a religiously divided town, including Calvinists, New Light Congregationalists, Unitarians, Trinitarians, and Universalists, among others. It would be impossible for him to please everyone. As historian Bob Gross writes, Ripley spent much of his time writing sermons in the manse. Christianity, as he interpreted it, constituted a system of doctrines and morals, of articles of faith and practical duties. Twice each Sabbath, once in the morning, again in the afternoon, he ascended the high pulpit in the meeting house and expounded on the scriptures, rehearsed the life, teachings, and sacrifice of Jesus Christ, and enjoined obedience to divine law. Not everybody was listening. At 63 years, his ministry would be First Parish's longest ministry, including the Second Great Awakening, the rise of Transcendentalism, Unitarianism, Universalism, Trinitarianism, the end of slavery, and disestablishment of religion from taxes. It was a trying and troublesome time. As long as First Parish and its ministers were funded from town taxes, and others were not, it kept a lid on multiple church buildings. But with this establishment, First Parish revenues dropped by nearly half, as people chose to worship elsewhere, following ministers and worship services that matched their faith. We've never seen such a tumultuous financial impact in any other time in our history as when disestablishment happened in the early 19th century. The most painful loss was the 1826 formation of Concord's Second Congregational Society, partially funded by Boston Congregational Churches, to be known as Concord's Trinitarian Congregational, or Tricon Congregation, which joined the Massachusetts United Church of Christ. Soon after, a group of young people founded Concord's first Universalist church on the Monument Square site of a greengrocer. For many years, First Parish remained the preferred religious community for Concord's elite, with Tricon welcoming a much more diverse group of Christian believers, and First Universalists being the most open and experimental in its approach to divine worship. The formal division between the Unitarian Humanists and the Calvinist Trinitarians was formalized by new institutional religious organizations in the 1820s. Unitarians were the elite. Harriet Beecher Stowe writes that all the literary men of Massachusetts were Unitarians. All the trustees and professors of Howard College were Unitarians. All the elite wealth and fashionable people crowded Unitarian churches. The judges on the benches were Unitarians. First Parish would remain for many years one of the largest and elitist Unitarian churches. Then in the 1830s, Concord's religious geography was completely rearranged with the rise of transcendentalism. The idea is that a direct experience of the divine mystery transcends whatever church doctrine or the Bible can teach us. In 1836, Ralph Waldo Emerson described his earliest transcendental experience. I love this passage. Crossing a bare common in snow puddles at twilight under a clouded sky, having in my thought not any occurrence of special good fortune, I have enjoyed a perfect exhilaration. I am glad to the brink of fear. Standing on bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I see nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part and particle of God. For me, this reads like a shaman's experience of becoming, through his prayers and supplications, part and particle of Manitou. This is human beings getting in touch with their spiritual connection. I guess I out myself as a transcendentalist when I declare that this passage still gives me goosebumps and may be Concord's greatest contribution to world religion. Transcendentalism emerged in Concord from Emerson's social circle, which included his wife Lydian, his aunt Mary Moody Emerson, his step-aunt Sarah Bradford Ripley, his brother Charles, his brother's financial fiancée Elizabeth Hoare, Boston intellectuals Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, Margaret Fuller, and Reverend Theodore Parker, as well as Waldo's neighbors, Henry David Thoreau, Ellery Channing, Frank Sanborn, and Bronson Alcott and Nathaniel Hawthorne. I have been honored to serve as the chairman of the board of a combined Unitarian United Church of Christ and American Baptist Seminary, Andover Newton. Served on the board of Stark King School for the Ministry, our most liberal UU seminary, and been an adjunct professor at Yale Divinity School. And over the 20 years since my ordination as a Unitarian Universalist minister, explored the relationships of many UU congregations to the divine mystery. I must say, to my mind, none offers a clearer path to becoming part and particle of the God than First Parish in Concord, if we choose to go that path. Ralph Waldo Emerson, then in his 20s and newly ordained, preached from this First Parish pulpit 16 times between 1827 and 1830. On September 28, 1828, he preached his first sermon as the assistant minister at Boston's Second Church. He soon married the love of his life, but when she died of tuberculosis shortly thereafter, Waldo abandoned the Unitarian ministry to find the meaning of life, which eventually led him to his next career as a lecturer on the Lyceum Circuit. We can't plan our lives, but we can choose how we respond to life. Through his trials and tribulations, Emerson is, for me, a great exemplar. As it became increasingly clear taxation to support a single church in each town would soon end, First Parish took steps to protect its assets. Concord employed its relationships in the state legislature to pass a new law creating religious corporations, which in Concord's case was named the Congregational Ministry Fund in Concord. So the state decree says, it is enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives and General Court assembled, and by authority of the same, that John White, Francis Jarvis, and John Tuttle, and such others as shall hereafter be duly appointed, be, and they are incorporated and made a body, politic and corporate, by the name of the trustees of the Congregational Ministers Fund in Concord. This meant when the churches all divided, Concord kept all the assets. First Parish kept all the assets. Everybody else had to start from scratch. In 1836, Reverend Ripley's young assistant minister, Hershey Goodwin, died suddenly. This means that First Parish needed a new assistant minister who could help the aged Ripley and replace him when he died. Emerson pushed hard for his friend, the young transcendentalist minister, Reverend Theodore Parker. The search committee settled on the less controversial Barzillai Frost. Emerson fumed. 2 years later, in his Divinity School address, Emerson described a dreadful worship service. The young minister rambled on with no indication that he had ever experienced joy or awe or love or even life itself. As he rambled on, it began to snow outside the window behind him. Emerson found the snow transcendent, not so the minister. When not traveling on the Lyceum circuit, every Sunday Emerson glared down from Frost's preaching from the side balcony. You guys like to go sit up there. That's just where Emerson used to look. Transcendent experience of the divine mystery was Emerson's all. This limited his engagement with social causes. That was certainly true when it came to addressing human slavery. While the Concord elite at First Parish weighed human freedom against slave owners' property rights, Tricon moved ahead of First Parish, declaring slavery immoral. They passed a resolution resolved that a standing regulation of the church that no person claiming property in human beings shall be eligible to membership in the church or shall be permitted the privileges of Christian ordinances with us. First Parish members, and until recently, even their ministers, owned slaves. So Tricon led in that moral stand. Ralph Waldo Emerson preached his last sermon at First Parish in January 1839. On Sunday, May 2nd, 1841, the day after his 90th birthday, a very feeble Ezra Ripley, in his 63rd year of ministry, which meant that everybody in the room had only known him as the only minister in their entire lifetime, made his way up into the pulpit to preach a last time. He had been called to be Concord's sole congregation, to lead Concord's sole congregation that day. And now there were Unitarians, Trinitarians, Anglicans, Episcopalians, Methodists, and Universalists congregations. He died that September, remembered as a perpetual mender of religious differences. Then came the railroads and industrialization. To lay down the railroad tracks through Concord Village and Concord Junction, the railroads hired 700 newly arrived Irish Catholic immigrants to work 12 hours a day for 6 days a week for only 60 cents per day, 40% less than the local day laborers were paid. They came with their large families and often lived in shacks built from scrap wood along the railroad tracks. When railroad construction moved further west, many decided to stay in Concord. They were dirt poor, but still this was a promised land. There were opportunities here they never would have had in Ireland. At the height of railroad construction, nearly a third of Concord's residents were poor Irish immigrants. To accommodate these new residents, the Roman Catholic Diocese bought and reconsecrated the abandoned Universalist Church, celebrating the first Catholic Mass in Concord in 1844. Given their high birth rates, within 20 years of their arrival, Concord Irish Catholics slightly outnumbered Concordians descended from the English settlers. Following Barzillai Frost in 1858, First Parish called its hugely popular minister, Grendel Reynolds. Reverend Dr. Reynolds was a scholar and a Unitarian theologian. Capping his remarkable 23-year ministry at First Parish, he was elected the national head of the American Unitarian Association. Reverend Dr. Reynolds wrote First Parish's first history of the church and its ministers. Unfortunately, given the time, he had to use a lot of euphemisms. And that took Eric Parkman Smith to help me unpack what they were really talking about. In seeking his replacement, First Parish returned to its roots, choosing Reverend Benjamin Buckley, yet another Buckley descendant, as their minister. While guest preaching at First Parish before his election, Benjamin stayed with his cousins Waldo and Lydian Emerson. Unfortunately, his esteemed and famous cousin Waldo died by the time he graduated from Harvard and took up his calling at First Parish. He married Mary Warren of Cambridge and raised 3 children in Concord. He served First Parish from 1888 to 1893 before seeking other pulpits. He was First Parish's last minister descended from Concord's founding families. It was the end of an era, and the church finances suffered, that the old families stopped feeling like this was their church anymore. St. Bernard's was now Concord's largest congregation. and it had extension services in West Concord. Tricon was Concord's fastest growing congregation, also holding Sunday school classes in West Concord, while providing worship services for the growing Protestant immigration populations. In addition, many other churches were emerging. West Union Church in 1886, an Evangelical Free Church, a Methodist Church in 1887, Trinity Episcopal in 1888, and the First Church of Christ Scientists in 1889. Concord's religious landscape was shifting to meet the emerging needs of the new people coming. In searching for its next minister in 1895, the old theologies of Arianism, Calvinism, evangelical piety, and transcendentalism no longer defined First Parish. Instead, the pragmatism of philosopher William James held sway. The parish called Reverend Lauren MacDonald, born in Nova Scotia, Canada, of Scottish descent, a graduate of Harvard, 1876, and Harvard Divinity School, 1881. He served Unitarian congregations in Ellsworth, Maine, Wolfboro, New Hampshire, and Boston before coming to Concord. He was First Parish's first non-American of Scottish descent, non-New England elite minister. In 1905, he married Mary Joseph Bygrave, a working-class woman of Irish Catholic descent, and they raised 3 children at First Parish. Reverend MacDonald was First Parish's first minister to be excluded from Concord's elite social circles. They wouldn't let him come. And his wife Mary was shunned by the Women's Parish Association. This is one of the darkest times when we were making this transition from being a congregation of the elite to a congregation of the town. Reverend MacDonald was self-disciplined, patient, modest, optimistic, and long-suffering. When the meeting house burned to the ground in the 5th year of his ministry, he took it in stride. He was well respected as a preacher and a pastor. He joined Concord's Freemason Lodge and Library Committee. His 29-year ministry lasted well into the 20th century, but ended on a tragic note. It appears that Reverend MacDonald loved cherry pies, so his wife baked him one from their backyard cherry tree. She didn't know their next-door neighbor had been spraying arsenic on the trees to treat a bug infestation, and as a favor had sprayed their trees as well. After his second helping, the minister dropped dead. Tricon's church building had burned down 6 months before, so the two congregations actually actively discussed re-emerging. But 100 years since separation, First Parish was too humanist and Tricon too Christian for them to merge. Without Lauren's salary, Mary had no income, no savings, and no pension. She needed to feed, clothe, and house their 3 children, Gordon, Teddy, and Edith. The church took pity on her situation and had a local retired builder add a room, what we call a tea room, onto the Right Tavern. So Mary ran a restaurant and tea room on the main floor while she and the kids lived upstairs. 10 years later, when the kids were now fully grown and she was able to move out of the tavern, during Prohibition, the Right Tavern turned into a speakeasy. But you needed to know the password. In 1924, First Parish called Dr. Johannes A.C. Faginger, who was ordained in the Dutch Reformed tradition and is an ancestor of our own Jim Hawkes. Dr. Auer was an avowed humanist, a theologian in the tradition of Erasmus, and a fond admirer of the philosopher Baruch Spinoza. Dr. Auer would be an original signer of the 1933 Humanist Manifesto. While a brilliant scholar, he was too radical for many in the congregation. So 4 years later, he accepted a Harvard professorship. Theology at First Parish was diverse and frequently changing. Auer was replaced by Reverend Ned Daniels, a liberal Unitarian Christian minister who resumed Christian communion after a 100-year lapse. For 100 years, we didn't have communion here, but he brought it back in the early 20th century. He successfully navigated the congregation through the Great Depression, built up the endowment, and raised congregational singing to its highest level yet. It's said that when they didn't have a music director, he would run down from the pulpit to the back and lead the choir in singing, and then come back up to the pulpit. He also was one of the editors of the first published UU songbook. But with the addition of Conantum, he developed dining circles for young married couples, expanded the religious education program, and helped to shape modern Concord. He was a devoted fan of FDR and a patriot during World War II. You couldn't say anything wrong about the president during his period as minister. Unfortunately, Concord demographics post-World War II were changing again. Canantum and other new housing developments were attracting Harvard and MIT-trained professionals from other parts of the U.S. who increasingly had different values than Concord's traditional elite. Many had no experience in town meetings, congregational polity, or UU worship. This greatly impacted Concord's schools, faith communities, as well as its weekend activities. Increasingly liberal Jewish people moved for Concord's excellent schools. Over the next couple of decades, their numbers grew. The first Minyan met at West Concord Union Church on Saturdays. As the congregation grew, they moved to Harvey Wheeler. Finally, they moved into First Parish, where they raised the funds to build Karim Shalom, Vineyard of Peace. And when it was completed in 1990, all of Concord's religious leaders walked their Torah with them to their new synagogue. This is a religious adaptation that Concord's Puritan founders could not have conceived of in their wildest dreams. In 1950, Reverend Damiel summarized First Parish's religious history as follows. Throughout its life, this church has been distinguished by its independence. A religion adequate for the needs of a changing world must reckon honestly with the day's moods, methods, and all reasoned investigation, and be continuously changing character of life and truth. It feels to me that's still true of Concord today, and certainly of First Parish. As the home of Concord's traditional elites, First Parish was aging and the whitest congregation in town, by a good measure, but they're all pretty white. In choosing their next minister, they wanted someone younger and with great oratorical skills. They found such a humanist with Arthur Jellis. In The Meeting House on the Green, which is the book that celebrates First Parish's 350th anniversary, Eric Parkman Smith described what happened. He says, the arrival of Jellis initially led to a most dramatic effect on the congregation. He appealed especially to the young. His youth, magnificent pulpit presence, and well-organized sermons addressed the problems of the secular world in the 1950s and 60s, producing congregations that exceeded for a time well over 200 worshipers each Sunday. He was anti-establishment, anti-tradition, and anti-Christianity. As a well-spoken humanist, the youth loved his religious rebellion. But then came the age of Aquarius, with anti-Vietnam protests against the U.S. government, long hair, burning draft cards, rising drug use, sexual promiscuity, and public nudity. Reverend Jellis defended the teenagers when their parents complained about what happened at their youth events. Then a sexton found a used condom in a back pew. This was not unique to First Parish in Concord. When I talked to other ministers about those early 70s, but the church's youth culture was out of control, and Reverend Jellis had to go. The congregation went into search just as Reverend Dr. Dana Greeley was completing his final term as UUA president. Dana was a Yankee Brahmin from Lexington who led the 1961 merger of the American Unitarian Association with the Universalist Church of America to form the UUA. Dana represented big tent Unitarian Universalism. He wasn't anti-war, he was pro-peace. He wasn't anti-establishment, he was pro-social justice. He wasn't anti-Christian, he embraced all the world's religions, and his ministry was healing for First Parish. As president of the UUA, he had marched with Martin Luther King in Selma and had advised President Kennedy on civil rights. In 1966, Dana met with General Secretary U Thant at the United Nations to discuss peace and social justice. At the 1975 bicentennial ceremony at the Old North Bridge, Dana was asked to introduce President Gerald Ford. Upon his retirement in 1986, First Parish established the Greeley Foundation for Peace and Justice to honor his life's work. First Parish has been at the forefront of LGBTQ rights since the 1960s. Introduced About Your Sexuality, AYS, classes in the 1970s, probably having something to do with the youth being out of control. And supported same-sex marriages from the 1980s. Reverend Kim Crawford Harvey, one of the UUA's earliest and most respected lesbian ministers, grew up at First Parish. Her preaching resembles that of her childhood minister, Reverend Dana Greeley. Concord has a remarkable number of subcultures for such a small town. By the early 1990s, the largest faith communities were St. Bernard's, which was Catholic, First Parish, which was Unitarian Universalist, Tricon, which is UCC, Our Lady, which is also Catholic over in West Concord, Trinity Episcopalian, and Kareem Shalom, Jewish. Most civic leaders came from one or another of these faith communities, so Concord politics remained small-town politics. People mostly knew each other. In 1988, First Parish called Reverend Gary Smith as our new senior minister. Over the next 23 years, he would be my spiritual teacher, friend, and colleague as I discerned my own path into full-time UU ministry. Gary was ordained in the United Church of Christ, but his ancestors were Maine Universalists, and he soon switched to the UUA. Under his leadership, First Parish grew to over 1,000 members and friends, requiring double services on Sundays, triple services on Christmas Eve, and $1 million annual operating budget. Gary shared his thoughts in his Concord oral history interview as follows. Concord is a very different community than Waterville, Maine. I often pinch myself. My roots are blue collar, and I think there are people in this town whose roots are blue collar, but it's easy to lose sight of it. I feel enormously privileged to be here. Gary brought First Parish into its 21st century role as a religious community open to all religious seekers. God is love, and life is short. Perhaps the most radical thing Gary did was to return to First Parish to a co-ministry model, like Buckley and Jones employed at First Parish's founding. Gary was a great preacher, teacher, and congregational leader, and the congregation supported his ministry with Reverend Karen Lewis Deutsch, 1988 to 1990, Reverend Beth Graham, 1990 to 1994, Reverend Adele Smith Penniman, 1994 to 1995, First Parish's first minister of color, and Reverend Jenny Rankin, 1997 to 2015. Upon Gary's retirement in 2011, the search began for a new congregationally and culturally appropriate senior minister. As a result, Reverend Howard Dana was called as the congregation's 18th settled minister and first openly gay minister. His ministry was one of inclusion, building a diverse team in terms of theology, gender, socioeconomic standing, and gifts for ministry. Reverend Amy Friedman earned her MDiv at Harvard, and then served for 10 years as the senior minister at Channing Memorial Church in Newport, Rhode Island, before coming here as our Minister of Religious Education. Reverend Liz Weber earned her MDiv at Andover Newton and was a chaplain before joining the staff as Minister of Pastoral Care. Reverend Paul Langston Daly earned his MDiv at Andover Newton, bringing his experience as a transgender male to our social action ministry. And when Howard moved on, it was time for First Parish to go into search again. So on May 11th, 2025, Reverend Jennifer Johnston was installed at First Parish's 19th lead minister and the first woman in that lead role. Though when I look around, all of our professional leaders are women. Reverend Johnson is lead minister, Reverend Jenna Crawford is Minister of Congregational Care, Reverend Amy Friedman as Minister of Religious Education, and Elizabeth Norton as Music Minister. Plus, Lisa Bennett as Chair of the Governing Board and Rosalind Romberg as Chair of the Trustees. This is something Reverend Peter Buckley could never have imagined. But times change, and First Parish has learned to adapt to change. Yet it's not just First Parish. Tri-Crown is led now by Reverend Rebecca Floyd Marshall and Reverend Martha Schick, with the welcome message on their website that no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you are welcome here. And it isn't just Tri-Con, but most liberal congregations in Concord are now led by ordained women. But most surprising to me, as I got ready to write this lecture, is the changes in Catholicism. The May 2026 newsletter of the Catholic Collaborative of Concord Carlisle, which includes Holy Family in Concord across the green here, extends the following Universalist welcome on its website. Welcome to our collaborative. You are welcome here just as you are, no matter your present status in the Catholic Church, no matter your family or marital situation, no matter your personal history, age, income, background, race, gender identity, sexual orientation, or ethnicity. No matter how you see your holiness or worthiness or where you find yourself on spiritual journey, it appears to me that the American Third Great Awakening may also be universalist. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. We'll take some questions.
Sure.
Hands up. Let me bring the mic over. Somebody must have
Was there anything in there that was
some
surprising to you?
thoughts to pursue. There's so much going on there. Okay.
Jim, could you explain why the King James Bible has never had any appearance here?
Yes. King James was trying to create a style of worship that reflected Roman Catholicism, that everybody used the same book every Sunday through the 2-year cycle or the 3-year cycle going through it. And he told them when they were doing the translation that they should change the languages about leaders, rulers, to make them kings and queens, so that you had to owe your obedience first to the king before to God, which really didn't sit very well with the covenantal congregations.
Other questions?
Jim, you said something early on about the Nipmucks influencing the Puritans and vice versa. Could you say more about that, and like where did it break down? Was it when the Aboriginals were sort of chased off, or what happened?
It feels to me like there was an underground thread that stayed in this area, even after 90% of the indigenous people were killed or pushed out. That the notion that the Puritans had, that they were the only accepted people, and that we should banish Baptists to Rhode Island, and we should hang Anne Hutchinson for being too outspoken about her beliefs, went away through that intercourse between the two. And I claim most of that for Thomas Wabben, who's my big hero in this whole context. He was the son of a shaman at the time the English settlers first started coming, and was actually living here in Concord on Nashottuck Hill when he fell in love with his then-to-be wife. And they moved over to where Boston is now in order to learn English and understand how to deal with these white Christians. And the founder, the person who was living, Blacksford, living there, basically educated him and introduced him to Roger Williams. And a lot of Roger Williams' writings we can see changing over time as a result of indigenous conversations of theology. It's the side of the story we don't often tell. We hold up Roger Williams as a hero, and you go, or you hold up the Algonquin Bible and say, this white guy came over here, and within a couple of years, he just figured out how to write in Algonquin. It doesn't hold up to reason. That this was a collaborative effort of people trying to make the best of a difficult situation.
Anyone else? Any questions from the chat?
Chat, can you hear that? But I had a question. I think it was a wonderful lecture, Jim. Could you comment on your own religious journey? How have you changed in your beliefs over the course of your lifetime?
Sure. I'm the son of a Baptist minister in a small town in Rhode Island. Of his 10 kids, he decided that I had the gifts of the Holy Spirit. He didn't tell me that, but I was speaking from his pulpit after winning all the Bible contests, speaking from his pulpit in my teenage years. And I was baptized at the age of 13, as was tradition in the American Baptist tradition, and had high expectations because I'd read my Bible. So I know that when you get plunged under, you come up and the sky's open and the dove descends, and you now know you're a child of God. He plunged me under the water, pulled me up, and all I got was cold and wet. About a year later, I was out at a Baptist youth conference held in a cabin in the woods. And we were looking at these 1970s film strips to try and scare us away from rock and roll and drugs and alcohol. And so as soon as we took a break, I scared it out of that dark room into the forest. And suddenly my eyes could see everything, the energy patterns of everything. I was one with creation. And I now knew what it felt like to be connected to the divine in a way that my being baptized never did anything for me. And so while I was bringing our kids up and building biotechnology companies or investing in new companies, I found time every year to spend a couple weeks with mystics in different religious traditions. So I've traveled with the Sufis, I've traveled with Taoists, I've traveled with Buddhists of a couple of different traditions. And it's been remarkable to me. They can look right at you and know whether or not you're making progress on the spiritual journey. And as a number of them have told me, they have no interest in spiritual tourists. Don't come to learn the whirling dervishes, all you want to know is how to dance. Come if you want to know God. And so my path, downstairs is my second book, Spiritual Pilgrim, which tells those stories about how I had my heart opened to the divine mystery. And it really is not much different from what Ralph Emerson was discussing.
Thank you very much, Jim. That's a wonderful viewpoint, or revelation, maybe is the right word. And thank you all for your questions and for joining us. Please join us downstairs for the reception and book signing. Again, down this way to the parish hall, or turn right to use the elevator. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jim.